The Bacchic Mysteries, Part 3 of the Eleusinian and Bacchic Mysteries, by Thomas Taylor, read by Dan Attrell. The Dionysiacal sacred rites instituted by Orpheus depended on the following arcane narration, part of which has been already related in the preceding section, and the rest may be found in a variety of authors. Dionysus, or Bacchus, Zagreus, while he was yet a boy, was engaged by the Titans. Through the stratagems of Juno in a variety of sports with which that period of life is so vehemently allured, and, among the rest, he was particularly captivated with beholding his image in a mirror. During this admiration, he was miserably torn in pieces by the Titans, who, not content with this cruelty, first boiled his members in water, and afterwards roasted them by the fire. But while they were tasting his flesh thus dressed, Jupiter, roused by the odor and perceiving the cruelty of the deed, hurled his thunder at the Titans, but committed the members of Bacchus to Apollo, his brother, that they might be properly interred. And this being performed, Dionysus, whose heart during this laceration was snatched away by Pallas and preserved, by a new regeneration again emerged, and being restored to his pristine life and integrity, he afterwards filled up the number of the gods. But in the meantime, from the exhalations arising from the ashes of the burning bodies of the Titans, mankind were produced. Now, in order to understand properly the secret of this narration, it is necessary to repeat the observation already made in the preceding chapter that all fables belonging to mystic ceremonies are of the mixed kind, and consequently the present fable, as well as that of Proserpina, must in one part have reference to the gods, and in the other to the human soul, as the following exposition will abundantly evince. In the first place, then, by Dionysus or Bacchus, according to the highest conception of this deity, we understand the spiritual part of the mundane soul, for there are various processions or avatars of this god, or Bacchuses, derived from his essence. But by the Titans we must understand the mundane gods, of whom Bacchus is the highest. By Jupiter, the demiurge, or artificer of the universe. By Apollo, the deity of the sun, who has both a mundane and supermundane establishment, and by whom the universe is bound in symmetry and consent through splendid reasons and harmonizing power. And lastly, by Minerva, we must understand that original, intellectual, ruling, and providential deity who guards and preserves all middle lives in an immutable condition through intelligence and a self-supporting life, and by this means sustains them from the depredations and inroads of matter. Again, by the infancy of Bacchus at the period of his laceration, the condition of the intellectual nature is implied, since, according to the Orphic theology, souls under the government of Saturn, or Kronos, who is pure intellect or spirituality, instead of proceeding as now from youth to age, advance in a retrograde progression from age to youth. The arts employed by the Titans in order to ensnare Dionysus are symbolical of those apparent and divisible energies of the mundane gods, through which the participated intellect of Bacchus becomes, as it were, torn in pieces. And by the mirror, we must understand, in the language of Proclus, the inaptitude of the universe to receive the plenitude of intellectual perfection. But the symbolical meaning of his laceration, through the stratagems of Juno and the consequent punishment of the Titans, is thus beautifully unfolded by Olympiodorus in his manuscript commentary on the Phaedo of Plato. The form, says he, of that which is universal, is plucked off, torn in pieces, and scattered into generation. and Dionysus is the monad of the Titans. But his laceration is said to take place through the stratagems of Juno, because this goddess is the supervising guardian of motion and progression. And on this account, in the Iliad, she perpetually rouses and excites Jupiter to providential action about secondary concerns, and in another respect, Dionysus is the ephorus, or supervising guardian of generation, because he presides over life and death. For he is the guardian or ephorus of life because of generation, and also of death because wine produces an enthusiastic condition. We become more enthusiastic at the period of dying, as Proclus indicates in the example of Homer, who became prophetic, mantikos, at the time of his death. They likewise assert that tragedy and comedy are assigned to Dionysus, comedy being the play or ludicrous representation of life, and tragedy having relation to the passions and death. The comic writers, therefore, do not rightly call into question the tragedians as not rightly representing Bacchus, saying that such things did not happen to Bacchus. But Jupiter is said to have hurled his thunder at the Titans, the thunder signifying a conversion or changing, for fire naturally ascends, and hence Jupiter, by this means, converts the Titans to his own essence. But by the members of Dionysus being first boiled in water by the Titans, and afterwards roasted by the fire, the outgoing or distribution of intellect into matter, and its subsequent returning from thence, is evidently implied. For water was considered by the Egyptians, as we have already observed, as the symbol of matter, and fire is the natural symbol of ascending. The heart of Dionysus, too, is, with the greatest propriety, said to be preserved by Minerva, for this goddess is the guardian of life, of which the heart is a symbol. This part of the fable plainly signifies that, while the intellectual or spiritual life is distributed in the universe, its principle is preserved entire by the guardian power and providence of the divine intelligence. And as Apollo is the source of all union and harmony, and as he is called by Proclus the key-keeper of the fountain of life, the reason is obvious why the members of Dionysus, which were buried by this deity, again emerged by a new generation, and were restored to their pristine integrity and life. But let it be here carefully observed that renovation, when applied to the gods, is to be considered as secretly implying the rising of their proper light and its consequent appearance to subordinate natures, and that punishment, when considered as taking place about beings of a nature superior to mankind, signifies nothing more than a secondary providence over such beings, which is of a punishing character, and which subsists about souls that deteriorate. Hence, then, from what has been said, we may easily collect the ultimate design of the first part of this mystic fable, for it appears to be no other than to represent the manner in which the form of the mundane intellect is divided through the universe. That such an intellect, and every one which is total, remains entire during its division into parts, and that the divided parts themselves are continually turned again to their source with which they finally become united, so that illumination from the higher reason, while it proceeds into the dark and rebounding receptacle of matter, and invests its obscurity with the supervening ornaments of divine light, returns at the same time without interruption to the source or principle of its descent. Let us now consider the latter part of the fable, in which it is said that our souls were formed from the vapors emanating from the ashes of the burning bodies of the Titans. At the same time connecting it with the former part of the fable, which is also applicable in a certain degree to the condition of a partial intellect like ours. In the first place, then, we are made up from fragments, says Olympiodorus, because, through falling into generation, our life has proceeded into the most distant and extreme division, and from titanic fragments, because the Titans are the ultimate artificers of things, and stand immediately next to whatever is constituted from them. But further, our irrational life is titanic, by which the rational and higher life is torn in pieces. Hence, when we disperse the Dionysus, or intuitive intellect contained in the secret recesses of our nature, breaking in pieces the kindred and divine form of our essence, and which communicates, as it were, both with things subordinate and supreme, then we become Titans, or apostates. But when we establish ourselves in union with this Dionysiacal or kindred form, then we become Bacchuses, or perfect guardians and keepers of our irrational life. For Dionysus, whom in this respect we resemble, is himself an ephorus, or guardian deity, dissolving at his pleasure the bonds by which the soul is united to the body, since he is the cause of a parted life. But it is necessary that the passive or feminine nature of our irrational part, through which we are bound in body, and which is nothing more than the resounding echo, as it were, of soul, should suffer the punishment incurred by descent. For when the soul casts aside the divine peculiarity of her nature, she requires her own, but at the same time a multiform body, that she may again become in need of a common form which she has lost through the titanic dispersion into matter. But in order to see the perfect resemblance between the matter in which our souls descend and the dividing of the intuitive intellect by mundane natures, let the reader attend to the following admirable citation from the manuscript commentary of Olympiodorus on the Phaedo of Plato. It is necessary, first of all, for the soul to place a likeness of herself in body. This is to ensoul the body. Secondly, it is necessary for her to sympathize with the image as being of like idea. For every external form or substance is wrought in an identity with its interior substance, through an ingenerated tendency thereto. In the third place, being situated in a divided nature, it is necessary that she should be torn in pieces and fall into a last separation, till, through the action of a life of purification, she shall raise herself from the dispersion, loose the bond of sympathy, and act as of herself without the external image, having become established according to the first created life. For Dionysus, or Bacchus, because his image was formed in a mirror, pursued it, and thus became distributed in everything. But Apollo collected him and brought him up, being a deity of purification and the true savior of Dionysus. And on in this account he is styled in the sacred hymns Dionysites. Hence, as the same author beautifully observes, the soul resolves according to a mystic and mundane revolution. For flying from an indivisible and Dionysiacal life, and operating according to a titanic and revolting energy, she becomes bound in the body as in a prison. Hence, too, she abides in punishment, and takes care of her partial and secondary concerns. And being purified from titanic defilements and collected in one, she becomes a Bacchus. That is, she passes into the proper integrity of her nature according to the divine principle ruling on high. From all which it evidently follows that he who lives Dionysiacally rests from labors and is freed from his bonds, that he leaves his prison, or rather his apostatizing life, and that he who does this is a philosopher, purifying himself from the contaminations of his earthly life. But farther from this account of Dionysus, we may perceive the truth of Plato's observation that the design of the mysteries is to lead us back to perfection, from which, as our beginning, we first made our descent. For in this perfection, Dionysus himself subsists, establishing perfect souls in the throne of his father, that is, in the integrity of a life according to Jupiter, so that he who is perfect necessarily resides with the gods, according to the design of those deities who are the sources of consummate perfection to the soul. And lastly, the thyrsus itself, which was used in the Bacchic procession, as it was a reed full of knots, is an apt symbol of the diffusion of the higher nature into the sensible world. And agreeable to this, Olympiodorus on the Phaedo observes that the thyrsus is a symbol of a forming anew of the material and parted substance from its scattered condition, and that on this account it is a titanic plant. This it was customary to extend before Bacchus instead of his paternal scepter, and through this they called him down into our partial nature. Indeed, the Titans are thyrsus-bearers, and Prometheus concealed fire in a thyrsus or reed, after which he is considered as bringing celestial light into generation, or leading the soul into body, or calling forth the divine illumination, the whole being ungenerated into generated existence. Hence Socrates calls the multitude thyrsus-bearers orphically, as living according to a titanic life. And thus much for the secret meaning of the fable which formed a principal part of these mystic rites. Let us now proceed to consider the signification of these symbols, which according to Clement of Alexandria belong to the Bacchic ceremonies, and which are comprehended in the following Orphic verses. A wheel, a pine nut, and the wanton plays, which move and bend the limbs in various ways, with these Thesperian golden fruit combine, which beauteous nymphs defend of voice divine. To this Clement adds esoptron, a mirror, pokos, fleece, of wool, and astragalos, the ankle bone. In the first place, then, with respect to the wheel, since Dionysus, as we have already explained, is the mundane intellect, and the intellect is of an elevating and convertive nature, nothing can be of a more apt symbol of intellectual action than a wheel or sphere. Besides, as the laceration and dismemberment of Dionysus signifies the going forth of intellectual illumination into matter, and its returning at the same time to its source, this too will be aptly symbolized by a wheel. In the second place, a pine nut, from its conical shape, is a perspicuous symbol of the manner in which intellectual or spiritual illumination proceeds from its source and beginning into a material nature. For the soul, says Macrobius, proceeding from a round figure, which is the only divine form, is extended into the form of a cone in going forth. And the same is true symbolically of the higher intellect. And as to the wanton sports which bend the limbs, this evidently alludes to the titanic arts by which Dionysus was allured and occultly signifies the faculties of the mundane intellect, considered as subsisting according to an apparent and divisible condition. But the Hesperian golden apples signify the pure and incorruptible nature of that intellect, or Dionysus, which is possessed by the world. For a golden apple, according to Sallust, is the symbol of the world. And this doubtless both on account of its external figure and the incorruptible intellect which it contains, and with the illuminations of which it is externally adorned, since gold, on account of never being subject to rust, aptly denotes an incorruptible and immaterial nature. The mirror, which is the next symbol, we have already explained. And as to the fleece of wool, this is a symbol of laceration or distribution of intellect, or Dionysus, into matter. For the verb sparato, which is used in relation of the Bacchic discerption, signifies to tear in pieces like wool, and hence Isidorus derives the Latin word lana, wool from laniando, as wellus from wellendo. Nor must it pass unobserved that lenos in Greek signifies wool, and lenos a wine press. And indeed, the pressing of grapes is as evident as a symbol of dispersion as the tearing of wool, and this circumstance was doubtless one principal reason why grapes were consecrated to Bacchus. For a grape, previous to its pressure, aptly represents that which is collected into one, and when it is pressed into juice, it no less aptly represents the diffusion of that which was before collected and entire. And lastly, the astragallos, or ankle bone, as it is principally subservient to the progressive motion of animals, so it belongs with great propriety to the mystic symbols of Bacchus, since it doubtless signifies the going forth of that deity into the department of physical existence, for nature, or that divisible life which subsists about the body, and which is productive of seeds, immediately depends on Bacchus. And hence we are informed by Proclus that the sexual parts of this god are denominated by theologians Diana, who, says he, presides over the whole of the generation into natural existence, leads forth into light all natural reasons, and extends a prolific power from on high even to the subterranean realms. And hence we may perceive the reason why, in the Orphic hymn to nature, that goddess is described as turning round silent traces with the ankle bones of her feet. And it is highly worthy of our observation that in this verse of the hymn, nature is celebrated as fortune, according to that description of the goddess in which she is represented as standing with her feet on a wheel which she continuously turns round, as the following verse from the same hymn abundantly confirms, the sense of which is moving with rapid motion on an eternal wheel. Nor ought it to seem wonderful that nature should be celebrated as fortune, for fortune in the Orphic hymn to that deity is invoked as Diana, and the moon, as we have observed in the preceding section, is the autochthon agalma physeos, the self-revealing member of nature. And indeed, the apparent inconstancy of fortune has an evident agreement with the fluctuating condition in which the dominions of nature are perpetually involved. It only now remains that we explain the secret meaning of the sacred dress with which the initiated in the Dionysiacal mysteries were invested for the thronismos, the enthroning, or sitting in a solemn manner on a throne about which it was customary for the other initiates to dance. But the particulars of this habit are thus described in the Orphic verses preserved by Macrobius. He who desires in pomp of sacred dress the sun's resplendent body to express, should first a veil assume of purple bright, like fair white beams combined with fiery light. On his right shoulder next a mule's broad hide, widely diversified with spotted pride, should hang an image of the pole divine, and daedal stars whose orbs eternal shine. A golden splendid zone then o'er the vest he next should throw, and bind it round his breast, in mighty token how with golden light the rising sun from earth's last bounds and night sudden emerges, and with matchless force darts through old ocean's billows in his course. A boundless splendor hence, enshrined in dew, plays on his whirlpools, glorious to the view, while his circumfluent waters spread abroad, full in the presence of the radiant God. But ocean's circle, like a zone of light, the sun's wide bosom girds, and charms the wondering sight. In the first place, then, let us consider why this mystic dress belonging to Bacchus is to represent the sun. Now, the reason of this will be evident from the following observations. According to the Orphic theology, The divine intellect of every planet is denominated a Bacchus, who is characterized in each by a different appellation, so that the intellect of the solar deity is called the Triatericus Bacchus. And in the second place, since the divinity of the sun, according to the arcana of the ancient theology, has a supermundane as well as a mundane establishment, and is wholly of an exalting or intellectual nature, hence considered as supermundane, he must both produce and contain the mundane intellect, or Dionysus, in his essence. For all the mundane are contained in the supermundane deities, by whom also they are produced. Hence Proclus, in his elegant Hymn to the Sun, says, "They celebrate thee in hymns as the illustrious parent of Dionysus." And thirdly, it is through the subsistence of Dionysus in the sun that the luminary derives its circular motion, as is evident from the following Orphic verse, in which, speaking of the sun, it is said of him that he is called Dionysus, because he is carried with a circular motion through the immensely extended heavens. And this with the greatest propriety, since intellect, as we have already observed, is entirely of a transforming and elevating nature, so that from all this it is sufficiently evident why the dress of Dionysus is represented as belonging to the sun. In the second place, the veil, resembling a mixture of fiery light, is an obvious image of the solar fire, and as to the spotted mule skin, which is to represent the starry heavens, this is nothing more than an image of the moon. This luminary, according to Proclus on Hesiod, resembling the mixed nature of a mule, becoming dark through her participation of earth, and deriving her proper light from the sun, so that the spotted hide signifies the moon attended with a multitude of stars. And hence, in the Orphic hymn to the moon, that deity is celebrated as shining surrounded with beautiful stars, and is likewise called Astrarche, or Queen of the Stars. In the next place, the golden zone is the circle of the ocean, as the last verses plainly evince. But, you will ask, what has the rising of the sun through the ocean, from the boundaries of earth and night, to do with the adventures of Bacchus? I answer that it will be impossible to devise a symbol more beautifully accommodated to the purpose. For, in the first place, is not the ocean a proper emblem of an earthly nature, whirling and stormy and perpetually rolling without admitting any periods of repose? And is not the sun emerging from its boisterous deeps a perspicuous symbol of the higher spiritual nature, apparently rising from the dark and fluctuating material receptacle, and conferring form and beauty on the sensible universe through its light? I say apparently rising, for though the spiritual nature always diffuses its splendor with invariable energy, yet it is not always perceived by the subjects of its illuminations. Besides, as psychical natures can only receive partially and at intervals the benefits of the divine irradiation, hence fables regarding this temporal participation transfer for the purpose of concealment and in conformity to the phenomena, the imperfection of subordinate natures to such as are supreme. This description, therefore, of the rising sun is a most beautiful symbol of the new birth of Bacchus, which, as we have already observed, implies nothing more than the rising of the intellectual light and its consequent manifestation to subordinate orders of existence. And thus much for the mysteries of Bacchus, which, as well as those of Ceres, relate in one part to the descent of a partial intellect into matter and its condition while united to the dark tenement of the body. But there appears to be this difference between the two, that in the fable of Ceres and Proserpine, the descent of the whole rational soul is considered, and in that of Bacchus, the scattering and going forth of that supreme part alone of our nature, which we properly characterize by the appellation of intellect. In the composition of each, we may discern the same traces of exalted wisdom and recondite theology, of a theology the most venerable for its antiquity and the most admirable for its excellence and reality. End of The Bacchic Mysteries by Thomas Taylor, read by Dan Attrell.